Welcome back to the hills. If you think that every hunt in Appalachia needs to be in like this big backcountry, monotonous timber where you're out in the forest and you're roughing it through the hills and just going up and down every mountain ridge to get to deer, you're wrong. And in this video, I'm going to kind of explain my thought process on how I go about hunting in Appalachia. So if you've watched any of my videos, I definitely do spend some time in bigger forest areas, right? I get into national forests for my public land hunting. I have friends and family all across the Appalachian Mountains that have big tracts of land that I hunt, and I don't want anyone to ever think that that's what you have to have. Like you have to have mastered to be able to be successful in Appalachia or anywhere for that matter. You don't have to have big pieces of property to go explore. So today I'm at home. My season's basically winding down to an end. I personally probably won't try to harvest any more deer myself simply because I have enough meat in the freezer. But I am up here and kind of prepping for either next year or if I have any friends that need to, put some meat in the freezer. And it got me to thinking like how successful I have been on smaller properties. So this property that I'm standing on right now might be an acre of woods. Now, with that being said, there are some key things that I try to dial in on. The surrounding properties, right? So this property that I'm standing on currently, I've got pasture land behind me this way. I've got pasture land over here, and I've actually got pasture land over there and behind it. So it's actually landlocked by pasture ground. So what does that mean? Well, those deer, they want to be feeding in those pastures at nighttime. However, they have to have somewhere safe to hide during the day, right? They don't want to be exposed out in these pastures, all day long out in the middle of the open for many reasons. You've got hunters, you've got coyotes, you've got all these things that are going after deer. So I set these little woodlots up in these smaller properties, and it makes almost the only secure bedding area that they can have and still have access to all four ag lands. So how does that benefit you? Because maybe you don't have ag land around you. Well, you can gain a lot of information from things like OnX or even Google Maps or any sort of mapping service. And I plan on one of these days doing a podcast where I kind of go over what I'm looking at when I do online mapping. But basically you want to key in on areas that you think, okay, that looks like a deer might want to feed there. Where is he or she, if you're hunting does, going to bed during the day, right? Because those are the primary principles of targeting deer, right? You want food, water, bedding, okay? Those are the three primary factors. And the more simple we can keep it, the better off we're going to be. So if you go back and watch my video from last hunting season, the 2024 season, there's a video on there called A Buck Named Stormy. Now, unfortunately, I butchered the footage. There's no lying about that. It happened so quick that we could barely get anything on film, which I'm not really complaining about. I like it when hunts are successful quickly like that. But that property laid out exactly like this property is here, where it had all these food sources around it that were perfect for nighttime feeding. But the only place that made sense for a deer to be during the day was in that property that I was on, which fortunately was family owned. But if you have a friend who is sitting, right in the middle of some prime agriculture or even prime oak stands, real thin oak stands that don't have any cover, anything of that nature, that and you have permission to hunt that property, don't sleep on it. So as you can see in here, this is all super, super thick. I've got cedars behind me. When Helene came through, right back over there, you see there's a lot of blowdowns. So it creates this perfect cover during the day where a deer can come in here and bed down and feel safe. Now, currently, at this current moment in time, because I have put a little bit of pressure on it, the deer aren't necessarily wanting to be in here. which brings me to my next point. If you are going to key in on some smaller pieces of property, this is the one time I will tell you, make sure the conditions are right before you go hunt it. You do not want to put unnecessary pressure on these small pieces because you will bump deer out very quickly. So what do those perfect conditions look like? Well, unfortunately, I can't answer that for you. That is going to be a case by case, property by property, and even a deer by deer basis. It's not a cookie cutter recipe for success. You have to know how the land lays. You have to know what, are the neighbors hunting? What's the weather doing? What stage of the rut are we in? How are the deer feeling? There are so many factors that go in. And unfortunately, there's a lot of trial and error, and there may even be some years where you just completely butcher it and there's really no hope for the property. And that's okay. That doesn't mean give up on the property indefinitely. That means learn from mistakes made and use that to benefit you going on later down a season or two down the road. Right now, currently, I don't know, you might be able to see it in the camera. This is just getting tore up by turkeys. It doesn't really benefit me much being in here today other than coming to talk to you guys. But right here, this little area right here, right there, up in there, this was very well-known bedding that I had been hunting for, well, I probably hunted it 4 or 5 times. And I did see quite a few does, but unfortunately, I got a little overzealous and I put too much presence in here and ended up bumping anything out before it drew the bucks in. Last season, there were quite a few bucks. I don't know if you can see that back there. There was a nice rub back in here. There's a couple on some cedar trees up in there that I'm not going to walk to and show you because I do actually have corn out there in hopes that I can bring something back in. If anything, just to, like I said, get a buddy on a deer or whatever I may do. So why am I saying all this? Well, going back to the beginning of the video, I said, don't think that I am always on big pieces of property because that's the furthest thing from the truth. Matter of factly, if I can teach anyone about anything when it comes to hunting Appalachia and the Appalachian Mountains, is learn how to take these big pieces of property and break them down into small 1 to 5 acre parcels, okay? You go through, and I do this thing where I call it speed scouting, which is where either right after deer season, I always try to do it after deer season rather than before, going back to that pressure aspect. But right after deer season, I'll spend a couple weekends or maybe even a couple of weeks, depending on what kind of time I have and what the weather's like. Obviously, I don't want to go out there and just freeze my butt off. But I'll go out there and I'll just take a piece of property that looks good to me on Onyx, going back to what I was saying about finding those little nooks and crannies where deer could possibly be hiding during the day. And I'll just zoom through there and see if I see any sign. Am I going to bump anything out of it? Yeah, probably. I 99% of the time, if I'm successful, that's exactly what I'll do, is I will go in there in the middle of the day and I'll bump everything out of it. But it's after season, so it doesn't matter. I've got all year long for those deer to come back and feel safe in that bedding area again. And that's basically how I do my scouting. I hardly ever scout in the summertime. The change that you're going to have from August to September to October and November and blah, 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 that changes so drastically and instantly, it's almost not beneficial to do that scouting. So my 2 times that I like to scout are in season. If I'm hunting an area and okay, all of a sudden I'm not seeing the deer that I think that I should be seeing, I get down and I start scouting. I do a lot of midday scouting in season. And then right after season ends, that is when I absolutely beat these mountains up and I scout as much as possible. And like I said, I use that principle of the 1 to 5 acres, right? Now, sometimes that 1 to 5 acres means that I'm, just beating boot rubber for 1.5 miles until I get where I need to go to scout. I am not looking at every little broken stick along the way. Am I missing things? Probably. But that's the whole point, is I am trying to break it down in small pieces instead of taking this gigantic 10,000, 20,000 acre forest and scout the entirety of it and just run around in circles and feel lost and desperate. 1 to 5 acres, I go scout it thoroughly. I spend, a couple hours inside of it and look for any bit of sign. And if it's great, I pin it on Onyx. On Onyx, they have that little line mapping where you can draw a box or any sort of shape that you want to. And I'll put a note in there like, hey, let's go check this out in late season. Or if I see some old sign, I'll say, let's go check this out in October, or whatever the case may be. Now that takes a little bit of understanding what sign is, and that's for a completely different video that I'll do on another day. There's plenty of other guys on here who have all sorts of scouting tips and tricks, so go back and watch them. But if you're coming to Appalachia and you're prepping for the 2026 season, 2027, maybe you're not going to come here until you're 60 years old. Who cares? Or maybe you are 60 years old and you're coming here. That is how I suggest breaking down these big monotonous forests so that you can be A, more successful, and B, not waste your time. I will tell you, the hardest thing to hunt deer in any mountain for that matter, but specifically at the Appalachian Mountains, is getting to the deer to begin with. These mountains are so big and monotonous, you have to find where they want to be. So if you watched my Thanksgiving Day buck that I took, that is from me breaking it down piece by piece, parcel by parcel, and figuring out where the deer were. It started with the does, and then I during my in-season scouting, I figured out where the bucks were trying to intercept those does at, and that's how I was successful. And it all begins by breaking it down. That forest that I was in was probably, I think it's around 18,000 total acres. Now it is split up a little bit, but that section that I was in, I have keyed in on it all season long. I've basically not touched any of the other. I've been in inside of 6 acres. We'll call it 6 acres, give or take an acre or two. So I say all this to say, do not let mountains scare you. You hear all the time, oh, you can't hunt deer in the mountains because the densities aren't thick enough and the properties are too big. And where that is true, if you just go and you try to set up blind in, like, let's say a draw or a drainage or anything of that nature, you could potentially be wasting your time. If you'll take this one little tip and just apply it to you, and no matter where you are in the country, whether it's here in the mountains or if you're out in big ag country, if you'll break it down into little tiny parcels and take, one little slice out of the pie every single time you go out and scout, I can guarantee you without a shadow of a doubt, you're going to be more successful in not only being able to find deer, but being able to find the caliber of deer that you are wanting to pursue. There's a pretty cool and old saying that I have lived by for a long time, and that is the only way to eat an elephant is one bite at a time, right? You're not going to eat an elephant in a whole sitting. I'm never personally going to eat an elephant. However, you understand the saying. You are not going to be able to be successful if you try to take these mountains and hunt them all in one season. It doesn't happen. Maybe you hunt the entirety of a mountain range in your lifetime, but to be successful, you have to take it one bite at a time. I really hope this video helped you. If it did, please leave me a like and a comment. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. And until next time, we'll see you on the hill.